Hello and welcome back once again to CBR MTG. It's been a little while. We've been resting our eyes over the course of 2020 and 2019, but we thought we might come back with just another little bit of Highlander content. As you've seen before on our channel and on our Twitch and on our website as well, we've kind of mostly been focusing on Highlander. Me personally, I've moved off 4-on formats and onto Singleton. And I was sort of looking, just because Highlander's in a really good place right now and it's really fun, and I can have the opportunity to make content specifically for Highlander and for the Highlander community. So I've been very excited to do that. And so with that being said, I'd love to welcome our guest, Padraig. Padraig, how are you?
I'm excellent, Angus. Thanks for having me on. How are you today?
Very good, thank you. So Padraig is here. He's going to talk about his deck tech in a second. This is a little deck tech series that we've done before. We've just sort of gone through in a little bit more detail what a deck is and how to play it. And this deck is called Mono U. No U. So Padraig, why don't you start off by talking a little bit about yourself and your experience in Highlander?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started playing Highlander in late 2017, and at the time I lived in Canberra. So the first deck that I built, I've always much preferred playing decks on the fair end of the spectrum, so aggro and mid-range decks, and I do love creatures. So I think the fewest creatures I've ever put in a deck is about 15. And the first deck that I built a Boros Hate Bears deck, so a red-white aggressive Hate Bears deck, which used things like Stoneforge Mystic, Blood Moon, Blood Sun, Magus of the Moon, Wasteland, and Strip Mine to try and keep your opponents off balance. And that was quite successful in the meta in Canberra at the time, because there were quite a few tempo decks and combo decks running around at the moment. I called the deck Boros Yeltsin because it makes everything more expensive, much like our dearly departed Soviet leader. And then at the end of 2018, I moved down to Melbourne, which is my ancestral home, and also obviously in Australian Highlander, the ancestral home of everyone smashing mid-range decks into each other, which I understand is a source of some derision to some people, and I can appreciate the arguments of the people who don't enjoy playing that type of Magic, but to me, that's ideal. Like when my first foray into competitive Magic was playing competitive Modern in 2015 and 16, and I built Abzan in that deck as well. And I just want to have everyone have a couple of creatures on the board, no cards in hand. We're just going to top deck until someone draws something the other person can't answer. That's the kind of Magic I like to play. I like interaction. I like a lot of answers. So when I moved down to Melbourne, I built a fairly standard Abzan list, and this was in the middle of Kess Pile Winter in Melbourne. The Boros Yeltsin deck, obviously not particularly well suited to that particular meta. So I built a stock Abzan list, and it was doing okay, but I thought, you know what, I kind of took a little bit of pride in the fact that I would turn up to a tournament at, say, General Games in Frankston or Malvern or Next Level Games in Dandenong, and I would be one of 2 or 3 players in the room who wasn't playing blue in some way, shape, or form. So I decided to really stake my name on that, and I built a 4-color No U deck, this deck. And simply, that was the main motivation of creating the deck. I wanted to play a deck that beat up on blue decks and did not play blue itself. And it was referred to as Nono Blue, as the nomenclature is Mono Blue is only blue, and Nono Blue is everything but. And I just cut a syllable, turned it into No U.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think being able to have access, even if it's in your sort of like your wheelhouse of decks that you own or can play, like just having that sort of mid-rangey, like a mid-rangey fair deck is something that actually a lot of players have started to enjoy just having in their arsenal, because
absolutely
a lot of people who really like mid-range also really like the mid-range mirror, because that's where you sort of your skills are a lot more tested. You're
absolutely. Like if I play this deck against another mid-range deck, almost every decision and almost every top deck is going to be relevant. Whereas if I'm playing a game against Reanimator or Flash Hulk or Thassa's Oracle, it's going to be entirely dependent upon whether I draw my disruption in time or if they just combo off and kill me on turn 3 or 4.
Yeah, and that's a perfect leeway into the actual the brunt of the deck. So we already heard about your name, No U.
Yes.
Which is a fantastic list. Our viewers will be able to see the deck list on their screen in front of them now. But why don't you walk us through, just walk us through the deck. Give us a quick deck tech, what works well and what doesn't.
Fantastic. So as you know, Wrenn and Six was recently pointed, and I decided to keep that particular Planeswalker in the list. Its ability to recur Strip Mine and Wasteland, as well as just fetch lands, is fantastic. And it also has a nice combo with if they blow up your Karakas, or if you can repeatedly cycle your entire Triome. Being able to pick up a Treetop Village that was previously Fatal Pushed or Lightning Bolted feels quite nice. And also the obvious combo with Nurturing Peatland and the other Horizon lands from Modern carries well over exactly the same into Highlander. Earlier versions of the deck, when the card points were a little bit less restrictive, also featured Mind Twist as well as Life from the Loam. But the points as they currently sit are Strip Mine, Karakas, Wasteland, Wrenn and Six, Green Sun Zenith, and Crop Rotation. I would definitely categorize this deck as a mid-range deck. However, it's probably a little bit more aggressive than some of the other mid-range decks, particularly blue-based mid-range or mid-range decks that feature cards like Ancestral Recall or Urian Sky Nomad. And I've played decks like that myself in the past as well. But this deck is definitely looking to find a really relevant threat that can kill your opponent very quickly and then just go to town. So that could be your Hex Drinker on turn 1. And if I play my Hex Drinker turn 1, turn 2, unless I suspect something, I'm probably going to drop my 2-drop. And then on turn 3, I'm probably going to try and level it up just to see if my opponent can actually answer it. And if not, I'm going to win from there. The same could be said for an unanswered Goblin Rabble Master or Clothis. Ramunap Excavator and Knight of the Reliquary are both there as part of the lands package. Like if I can strip lock my opponent, that's a fantastic angle by which I can either slow down their game plan by enough that they just can't keep up with the pressure that I'm putting on them. If they're a combo or a control deck, I can just prevent them from enacting their game plan entirely. And against other mid-range decks or aggro decks, it's just about buying time. And also, obviously, Knight of the Reliquary can get very huge. Like I have had Knight be a 9/9 quite consistently in my games, particularly back when the deck featured Life from the Loam. Talia Heretic Cathar is a very recent addition. I've ported her over from my green-white hate bears list, and I'm yet to see exactly how she pans out, but I do suspect she's going to be quite excellent because she's good in almost every matchup. Against aggro decks or other mid-range decks, she slows down their mana and their creatures and is a 3-power first striker. And then against control decks or combo decks, she slows down their mana and represents a relevant clock. So I'm optimistic that Talia will hit the ground running, so to speak. And then the top end of the deck, the Bloodbraid Elf, Jailer, Queen Marchesa, Questing Beast, Titania, they're just powerhouses. Those are just out of the 4 colours that I was in. Those were the cards and the creatures, the threats that made the most sense for me to include.
I've often seen a Questing Beast in recent lists as it's quite proven itself quite quickly, but Titania is also a mainstay in Highlander. Is just fair or not fair is just a really fantastic creature to have in your arsenal as well.
Absolutely. Not only does she generate usually 10 power and 6 toughness, if I've got a Wasteland or a Strip Mine, I get another in my graveyard. I get another shot at those. Failing that, I just get the fetch land. I think that there was a recent episode of the Highlander podcast, the second most recent episode, where they spoke about non-pointed cards printed in the last 8 or 10 years that had fundamentally changed Highlander, and both Questing Beast and Titania were mentioned and discussed on that episode as simply being the best creatures in green at that respective mana cost at the moment. Absolutely. And I'm very much inclined to agree.
Yeah, absolutely. The Palace Jailer and the Queen Marquesa is also something that you mentioned before as part of your top end. The Monarch, Palace Jailer has seen play in Legacy, Death and Taxes for actually quite some time now. And its position has, of course, fluctuated depending on the slots available. But the act of just becoming the Monarch in a non-blue deck is really, really efficient, especially if you're controlling the board as your deck presumably does by the way it's built.
Yes, no, if my opponent ever has more than 2 creatures in play, it's very likely that I'm going to lose that match simply because I will that is one of the deck's biggest weaknesses. If my opponent out-tempos me, the deck can struggle to come back from that. if I get a Clothis, for example, I can regain that life and perhaps stabilize a little, but failing that, it's basically going to be Bloodbraid Elf or double removal spell or bust, simply because my opponent will be able to just swing around me. And that's exactly why I included the Monarch cards. I think they're criminally underplayed in Highlander, becoming the Monarch. Both of these cards represent decent. They're already 1-for-1s based on the fact that you become the Monarch. And then Queen Marchesa is also a 3/3 with Death Touch and Haste. And the Palace Jailer exiles a creature an opponent controls until they take the monarchy away from you. So basically my critical process for card evaluation has always been floor, and that is one of the critical things in almost every card I'm playing in this deck. The flaw is my opponent kills it straight away, and I'm fine. I very, very rarely open myself up to being 2-for-1 or 3-for-1.
Yeah, absolutely, and you can tell that with Bone Crusher Giant, Tireless Tracker, Rabble Master, and even Quasali Primate Scavenging Ooze. Like these sorts of creatures, like they might die, but you will have at least a goblin token or a clue, or you've already used the stomp on your Bone Crusher Giant. Like fantastic list, and the fact that everything that you've already done is just it's the perfect mid range deck, right? Because you're black based mid range, as you mentioned before. Really try to nug down everyone's resources, including your own, but your top decks are going to be better than theirs. That's
exactly the state, and that's why I have the 2 Lilianas as well. I recently, when that was my most recent deck decision, actually. At the bottom of the Moxfield page, there is a very long maybe board, a considering section, and because my most recent decision was Wrenn and Six was pointed, I needed to drop a pointed card, and then I also needed to put a non-pointed card back in the deck to replace it. So I decided to drop the Life from the Loam, and Liliana the Last Hope to go alongside Liliana of the Veil was the card that I decided to bring in, simply because of the ability to win the game going long or going short. There's nothing wrong with just dropping her -2ing to regrow a Scooze or a Bone Crusher Giant, or if you're really, really lucky, you'll -2 and you'll hit your own Questing Beast, and you'll just pick up Questing Beast, play it next turn. Can you answer that? And even if they do counter the Questing Beast, I've still got a Liliana on 1 loyalty in play.
And you have the added benefit of with Gilligan's command as well as another sort of famous regrow effect by putting those really, really, really haymaker creatures just straight back in your hand. Like maybe they got them away the first time. It's unlikely they're going to be able to get through the second time or the third.
Gilligan's command is probably the archetypical card for this deck list, and I probably should swap Angrath's Rampage with Gilligan's command as the preview image on Moxfield.
I think so too.
Yeah, which is a great line into the non-creature spells that I am playing. This is all fairly standard, self-explanatory. The only stuff that I'll really mention is I play both Green Sun Zenith and Crop Rotation as pointed cards because I love flexibility. I can crop rotate, I can get a Karakas, I can get a Strip or a Waste, I can get a Nurturing Peatland. Hell, I have crop rotationed for Raging Ravine and then won the game 2 turns later with that exact same Raging Ravine before. It's just the ability, and then that's if I'm not getting the straight waste. Like I was in a situation where my opponent and I both had just absolute nothing. Like it's like 2 boxes in round 14 and you can barely lift your own arms, let alone throw an effective punch. I'm like, hell yeah, end of your turn, sacrifice my I think it was a Bayou, go and get my Raging Ravine. Next turn, untap, tacky for 4. Next turn, untap, tacky for 5, win. And then Green Sun Zenith can actually do the same thing by fetching Knight of the Reliquary if I want to go down that line. But there's also so many other options. If I can do it for 1 and get Hex Drinker or Deathrite Shaman or Noble Hierarch if I need the power, the threat, or the ability to hate on their graveyard. I've got good options at every stage of the curve. At 2, I've got Scooze and Goyf. At 3, I can get Excavator, Tracker, Knight of the Reliquary. And then at 4, I'm obviously getting Questing Beast or Titania. The remaining instants, Colligans, Ass Blast, Abrupt Decay, Swords, just good removal spells. And I'm allergic to playing black and not playing him, Thoughtseized and Inquisition. I think so too, yeah. We talk about a lot of, I think a lot of people talk about Dits as the Duress, Inquisition, Thoughtseized, but I would dare say that it's the him, Inquisition, Thoughtseize, the hits that really frame Highlander in black. Yeah, and I understand that the people may be saying double black, really, with this mana base, and I'll go to the mana base just after touch on a couple of these last non-creature spells. But let me assure you, it is not without its problems, but as an experienced pilot in the deck, I do normally not struggle too much. Angras Rampage and Dreadbore, just two of the best removal spells around. The number of times I've been able to Angras Rampage, and the artifact and the Planeswalker things are so relevant. Like, I've Angras Rampaged, making my opponent sacrifice their Mycosynth Lattice after I attack and kill their Khan, the Great Creator. Or I've Angras Rampage to make them sacrifice the Batterskull rather than the Germ Token. Or you can make them sacrifice the Narset Parter of Veils or the Teferi Time Raveler that they just slammed against you. It's just the flexibility. People are like, sacrifice effects, but no, they really come through for you. Crucible of Worlds is there pretty much entirely as a value engine and does the same thing that Wrenn. Basically, the games that I was happiest with how the deck was performing were games where I did have access to my graveyard lands with either Wrenn and Six or Realm of Excavator. So I decided, you know what, I'm playing Realm of Excavator because it can attack and it is green sun zenithable, but let's play the Crucible. And so far, the other great thing about it is people are terrified of it. So I have had a game once where I played my Crucible of Worlds out first, and then my opponent, who was playing basically the Yidris type deck, they then on their turn played a Deathrite Shaman and Kolaghan's Command to destroy my Crucible of Worlds and force me to discard a card. And the card I discarded was relevant, but it wasn't backbreaking. But then on the next turn, I was able to just play Goblin Rabblemaster, and the fact that they had lost access to that shock was really quite excellent. Mox Diamond, it's a lands deck. I've got so much lands, not into the Marit Lage combo, but I think Mox Diamond is an incredibly powerful card, and I very frequently have the ability to simply regrow the land that I discard. And alternatively, being in a 4-color deck, the ability to tap for any color of mana is quite relevant. My best opening hands absolutely contain Mox Diamond. And then Sylvan Library was just a card that I was boarding in basically every match. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to main board this. And unless you're playing against some form of high progressive red deck, or you're playing against a Rug Life variant that's already got you on the back foot, you're never happy. You're never unhappy to top deck it. Yeah,
and even at the very least, it's just a ponder at the start of your turn, even if you don't want to pay the 4 life. And then if you're in those combo matchups where your life isn't relevant, or those control matchups, it works double duty. Just taking 8 life for 2 cards, you're almost always happy to take that.
For sure. It doesn't matter if I'm on 8 or 16 if my opponent's going to reanimate Gristlebrand on turns 2 or 3.
And that's sort of, sorry, just to interrupt that, say, like an interesting look as well into what lands decks, I say in inverted commas, can sort of look like in the future, or what another variant of a land deck is, because this is a mid-range deck, but you have all these sort of land synergies, but you've just you've allowed yourself to not fall too deep, because of course we have Fast Bond in this format, and as you said, Life from the Loam, which you were playing at some point, but you are now not. But this is like, you're not trying to assemble Dark Depths, Marit Lage, and you're not hindering your mana because of it. And I think that sort of helps you. It helps you by having such a great mana base, because it's a singleton. You can only have 1 Tundra, 1 Badlands, 1 Bayou. Like, it actually allows you to sort of fetch out the exact color that you need because of that situation. So, do you think there's any sort of any other reasons? I was interested as well looking at your list, because I have seen a lot of 4-color lists lately, especially over 3-color lists. Is there anything that you could possibly say further to why 4-color over 3-color, and even 2-color, or why not even go 5-color?
Yeah, I don't want to go 5-color because I think that not only would that contravene the founding philosophy of the deck, I'm also not entirely certain exactly what I would be adding from blue. Like, off the top of my head, I think I would mainly be adding things like Brainstorm and Dak Faden, and perhaps some of the more potent cantrips. But I love my non-blue threats. I think if I was to put blue in the deck, it would be mainly as glue, and I would not want to be playing counterspell. And with regards to what you said about how this is how land decks could look in the future, I like to think of myself as just being on the other side of the coin. So if you think of the wheel of archetypes in the I would classify this as being on the far right 4-color mid-range quadrant, as in it is proactive rather than reactive, and it is fair to a T outside of the strip lock combo, obviously. And the other variation of land decks, the ones that do include Zuranor, Fast Bond, and the Marit Lage combo, they're almost mid-range combo decks or mid-range control combo decks, whereas me, I'm a mid-range aggro deck or a mid-range tempo deck, so I'm definitely want to go a little bit harder and faster. As for the construction of the mana base, I think that my curve is not much of a curve, to be honest. It's 10 1-drops, 10 2-drops, 11 3-drops, 4 4-drops, and 1 5-drop. So more of a mana wall. And in all honesty, perhaps that could be tweaked better. Perhaps the deck would be better served by either dumping it down on 2-drops and increasing 3-drops and mana dorks in the hopes of going mana dork into 3-drop, or perhaps I should simply decrease the number of 1-drops in favour of 2-drops. But for the moment, I'm actually quite happy with how the deck is performing. I started out, I put in Strip Waste. I want to play those cards. The next additions were all 6 of the relevant dual lands and Karakas and Dryad Arbor, because nothing wrong with Green Sun Zenith for 0 to get your Dryad Arbor, because that is also another way of accelerating to 3 mana on turn 2 rather. Yeah. I knew that I wanted to play 23 lands rather than 22 or 24. 24 would definitely open me up to a potential flood, and playing 22 lands in a deck that has 5 spells that cost 4 or more, I think is quite ambitious, especially considering this is a deck that sacrifices its own lands to destroy your opponents.
It's interesting that you've been able to fit these. I was going to say it's interesting that you're able to fit these creature lands in there, considering the 4-color mana base. But from what you've said, it's not only fine, but actively good to have access to those creature lands.
Absolutely, they're an integral part of the control of the matchup against control, as well as the matchup against fellow mid-range decks. I could only fit 2 basics in, and at the moment I am satisfied with the relative level of people playing back to basics and Blood Moon effects in the format, sticking to those 2, and the power that the utility lands bring to me is just so incredible. Being able to recur Nurturing Peatland, being able to dome your opponent with Ravine, and Treetop Village being able to cycle in Dartha Triome, and Karakas is honestly mainly included because at the moment I'm seeing a lot of legendary creatures being played. I have, I think once, bounced my own questing beast to protect it from an edict effect where it was the only creature that I controlled. But for the most part, I am removing opposing blockers for the most part. Things like Tasiga or Kess or Talia Heretic Cathars that my opponents play against me. That is the main function of Karakas, as well as, of course, being fantastic tech against Reanimator, where the majority of their threats that they go to reanimate for are often going to be legendary.
Absolutely, and I love this idea of Karakas as a aggressive play, because if you see your opponent put down a Karakas, suddenly you can't play your Thalia in your hand, or you can't play your Tasker, as you said, or Leovold. And Leovold at least draws you a card, but you're wasting 3 mana just to have your opponent hold up 1 mana for the rest of the game, and that's that can really put a damper on
even
your
Jace Prince Prodigy has been bounced before, and the tempo that you deny your opponent there by removing their blocker, unwinding 2 mana, and denying them access to the loot effect. It's I highly rate Karakas in this deck, and I think because of the prevalence of land tutor effects in this deck, I'm always of the opinion that you want to draw your pointed cards, right? So given that my deck was already constructed in such a way that enabled me to search a toolbox of lands, I figured a pointed land that is relevant, hell yeah, I'll sign me up, brother.
I think so too. And moving on, that was great. Moving on to the sideboard now. Would you just go over your sideboard cards, your choices for them, and what maybe people could bring in and side out if they wanted to play this deck themselves?
Absolutely. So starting out at the most obvious inclusion would be Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast. I'm of the lukewarm take that these are the best sideboard cards in Highlander, and being in red, having access to these is a big reason to even be in red. I have yet to build a deck that doesn't have access to red, that the sideboard doesn't start with these 2 bad boys. Angel's Grace is actually currently in because there is quite a lot of Thassa's Oracle being played, and if you respond to their Thassa's Oracle trigger with the Angel's Grace, their trigger will resolve, but they will not win the game, and then they'll need to attempt to win from there with however much of their hand and library is currently in exile. Obviously sometimes your opponent doesn't need to exile their entire library, and they can. I have in the past Angel's Grace to prevent a Thassa's Oracle trigger from being lethal, to which my opponent said fine. They untapped, bounced their own Thoracle, milled themselves for 4, and then played the Thoracle again. And that got it. I was just impressed that they had that exact combination of cards left in their library. But there are also other times where the Thoracle player goes all in on the combo, and they put the Thoracle trigger on the stack with no cards left in their library. So you just cast Angel's Grace, untap, upkeep, draw, pass back to you. They lose on their draw step. Yeah, and it also has game against other decks as well. So, for example, if you're playing against a Storm deck or the Rug's Browers deck that Sophie's been playing recently, any deck that really goes in for that Alpha Strike mentality, Angel's Grace is fantastic. And it's worth noting, it has split second. It cannot be responded to. Once it's on the stack, it's like a giant, Acme 10-ton heavyweight that drops down the stack, and nothing else can be put on it until it's finished resolving. It's like, I don't even know why the game gives your opponent priority after one person has cast a split-second spell, because the only thing they can do is float mana, realistically.
Yeah.
Then there is still an element of graveyard decks being played in Highlander, and that's why Relic of Progenitus is present, and that predominantly I'm frightened of Flash Hulk lists and Reanimator lists, which is why Relic is present. Containment Priest for similar reasons. It counters Flash, it counters reanimation spells, all sorts. Veil of Summer is self-explanatory. If you're playing green, put Veil of Summer in your sideboard, and then if your opponent's playing a black-based mid-range deck or a blue-based mid-range / control deck, you bring it in. I was low on Diefleet Daredevil for last year, but now at the minute there's a lot of people playing Ancestral Recall, and it's I think that Diefleet Daredevil is time in the sun is come again. He's good against combo decks and control decks because they like to recur the same sorceries. They like to have access to cards in their graveyard, and there's nothing wrong with Diefleet Daredevil on turn 3 and then just use your opponent's Brainstorm or Ponder. Like, that's a completely excellent play.
Absolutely. I've seen a little bit of Diefleet Daredevil popping back up, as you said, for very similar reasons. Ancestral Recall, people have decided that it's the card to cast every now and then, so in your deck. So it's nice to have access to that for sure.
Indeed. Daredevil also fits in. Daredevil combined with Plague Engineer and Knight of Autumn also form my anti-creature-based aggro spectrum. On Diefleet Daredevil there, if you get an instant or sorcery, great, but also 2-power first strike, blocks for days, son.
Oh yeah.
Knight of Autumn, I love me some modal cards. It comes in against artifact aggro decks. It comes in against artifact combo decks. Like, predominantly it's there as just a Reclamation Sage with a little bit more flexibility, Speaking of the artifact decks, Nullrod, I'm umming and ahhing between Nullrod and Collect Roof at the moment, predominantly because Collect Roof is more easily answered. However, it can be Green Sun's Zenith for, whereas Nullrod is much more resilient. But I have also recently discovered the beauty of Force of Vigor. You can even cast this through a Back to Basics or a Blood Moon to destroy said enchantment, and that's part of why I've included it over some other form of artifact enchantment disruption that, is potentially less card disadvantageous. But I'm really high on Force of Vigor in terms of the flexibility it provides you by being instant speed, by being able to target 2 different permanents, and by being able to cast free as long as it's your opponent's turn.
Yeah, that's big game for 4 and 5 color decks against Blood Moon for sure.
Absolutely. And then the last cards to include are my Thronderlast Troll, Ashiok, Dreamrender, and my Choke, and these are predominantly my counter blue mid-range spells. Obviously, Ashiok also has game against graveyard decks in a sense, but I have found that he's fantastic against things like a Sultai Dredge list or a Lands list, which is one of the slower one of the slower graveyard decks. But if someone's going to turn 1 mill, discard, entomb something, and then turn 2 reanimate it, Ashiok's just a turn 2 slow. So that's why I play Relic as well, because you need to be able to have that immediate graveyard hate. But Ashiok's the first bit of text preventing people from searching their library. You turn off the tutors, you turn off fetch lands. There's just so much value to be gained from Ashiok that people treat Ashiok quite similarly to how they treat Crucible of Worlds. Even though it's not actually going to be that backbreaking or do that much to advance my game plan, absent certain spells or cards from my opponent, it's kill on sight, and that is also always valuable for a mid-range deck, because if you kill something like that instead of a threat, it means I'm better able to kill you.
And I was just going to say as well, the down tick. The static ability of Ashiok is fantastic, of course, stopping tutors and fetches as you mentioned, but the down tick. Even in those mid-range decks, it's unanswered. It's 4 goes, and then it stays on the battlefield for as long as you want. And if you think it's going to go the next turn, you can get rid of it. But that's 20 cards. That's
it is 20 cards.
Nothing to sneeze about.
It also has game against Thoracle. Some Thoracle decks are playing Mystical Tutor, and a lot of Thoracle decks are playing Gifts Ungiven. You can't search your library for up to 4 cards with different names if Ashiok Dreamrender is in play on the opposing side of the battlefield.
Oh yeah.
And then
good timing as well with the 3-drop before the Gifts Ungiven.
Yeah. And for anyone who wants to play this deck or a similar mid-range deck, mid-range with a bit more of an aggressive deck, which is bent, which is what the red kind of implies. This is just a Jund deck that's got a little bit extra, a little bit spicier. The most critical formula there is to know your role and to know key cards. So you need to identify. This is where format knowledge comes in critical, and that's just part of the reality of being a mid-range player. Everyone else there are going to be, if you're playing a fair deck, the unfair decks are going to do stuff that you can't compete with. They don't need to understand what you're doing because they can just go off and play solitaire, but you need to understand what they're doing if you're going to have a hope in hell of disrupting it. In dedicated Death and Taxes, that comes down to knowing what to name with Phyrexian, Revoker, and whatnot. And in this list, it comes down to identifying which cards are relevant. So knowing that for example, if a deck is going to kill you quite quickly and doesn't need its graveyard, absolutely board out Clothis, absolutely board out Tireless Tracker, absolutely board out Hex Drinker. If a deck is going to vomit out its hand very quickly, board out Hymn to Turak and Thought Season, maybe only leave in Inquisition. The cards that come out most frequently are the hand disruption spells against decks that hand disruption is no longer particularly relevant. Some of the threats are, for example, there are some games where Ramanov Excavator is just going to die, and it's not going to be able to generate value unless I have exactly fetch land or strip/waste in response. There are very few situations where I would board out Liliana the Last Hope, but there are quite a few where I would board out Liliana of the Veil. And then further into the non-creature things, if your opponent's playing a very, very fast deck, the first 2 cards that drop are Sylvan Library and Crucible of Worlds, simply because they're expensive, they're slow, and they don't block.
Yeah. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, that's the critical axiom. You identify your role in the matchup. Am I the beatdown or am I the control deck? You identify how your opponent's going to kill you, and then you identify what cards in your list are going to enable you to disrupt your opponent. And then the final thing you just need to have in the back of your mind is don't board out too many threats. Because if you board out 5 or 6 creatures, and they're all creatures, all threats, and then you board in your Red Blasts and your Ashiok and your Null Rod and whatever it is, you've very heavily diluted the balance of the deck and you've turned yourself into a control deck. Sometimes that is a desirable outcome with your sideboarding, but if your opponents also play on a mid-range or a creature-based controls, creature-based aggro or combo strategy, not having creatures of your own and not being able to finish the game rapidly is terrible. So there's nothing more terrifying than being across the table from a Thoracle deck or a Sprowis deck that's got 1 creature and 2 cards in hand, and then you top deck Abrupt Decay. And you play the Abrupt Decay, you kill their creature, they just play another one the next turn. Do you need to be able to disrupt your opponent and then kill them? Can't just disrupt them.
Absolutely. That's the good advice for a lot of matchups, I think, but specifically these mid-rangey decks, you being able to find out what access you're trying to hit on, and then making sure that you can still implement that outcome while bringing in these silver bullets that you have in your sideboard.
Absolutely. And then just tutoring for them as you can. The only tutors in the deck are neither Reliquary and Green Sun Zenith, but then sometimes you do have to mulligan to something. But I've found that at the moment, playing on webcam, and back when physical Magic is allowed again in Melbourne, playing physical cards in Melbourne, the decks that are doing unfair combo things, they tend to not be as balls to the wall, must get it done on turn 2 or 3 as they potentially were in 2019 and 2018.
I think so too. And that's a good point for combo decks as well. It's just maybe just a place where if this deck is good, you maybe just don't want to go balls to the wall combo, because their early Thoughtseize or Hymn to Torak, or even just playing those Angel's Graces from your board can really put a damper on it. So being able to sort of, if you're playing combo, to just maybe have combo as your side plan and then mid-range as maybe your game plan. That's really fantastic. And I appreciate you mentioning the webcam playing on Discord, because if you want to find Padraig in the future, you can find him at our Discord, at our 7 Point Highlander Discord. We play Highlander every now and then, so I'll make sure to put all those links in if you're excited to play. We're usually very proxy friendly and stuff like that. So
please do. I'm playing in the FNM this very night on the day of recording.
Oh, well, that's very exciting, and maybe I'll see you on the battlefield.
Oh, fantastic. Looking forward to
it. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us. My name is Angus Mackay. This is Padraig.
Thank you very much, everybody.
And we'll see you later. Thanks.
Bye-bye.